years ago, I would often be at parties where I was kind of bored or hungover or tired, and somebody would come up to me and strike up that like immediate boring person thing that they say to you first. It's just like, what do you do? And I would always so happy to be able to work with them. And I also I work with these two guys a lot. This is Mark Hansen, who some of you have met on the right, and Ben Rubin on the left. And Mark and Ben are really my heroes, and the idea of working with them always seems really surreal to be sitting in a room and cooperating with these guys. And of course at Eyeo, I'm part of a really great team, and a lot of people have been talking about Eyeo being the sort of Dave and Jer show, but Wes, who introduced me, and Julian, who's not actually here this year, did way more work than I did. I sent out 49 emails. That's all I did. Wes and his group built the website. Julian built the mobile app, and Dave, as you know, did basically everything else. But let's get into the real meat of things. I'm going to start by talking about a project which considers the concept of nearness. Considers the concept of personal location. It's a project that I introduced for the first time in public this time last year at the conference. So before I get there, though, we're going to walk through an older project. And this is one of my favorite people in the world, somebody that I really admire and respect, maybe the smartest person I've met. His name is Albert Laszlo Barabashi. We can give that a name as well. And we can continue this process, really simple idea of taking a number and putting it into a multi-dimensional space and kind of being able to map that number back down into two-dimensional space. And maybe you know where I'm going with this. I did a really terrible thing in setting up this conference. I used to play in a rock band, and the first rule of playing in a rock band was never book anyone better than you to open the show. And the terrible mistake that I've made in this conference is I've asked 49 people who were better than me to play in the show. People who are better at graphic design, people who are better at programming skills. Hi, Robert. People with better artistic ability, people with better foresight, better storytelling, more charming, better dressers, and so on and so on and so on. By the way, I'll tell you the dumpster diver story quickly. I did a talk last fall in Vancouver, and somebody posted a comment. They said, this talk was really good, but I wish he hadn't dressed like a dumpster diver. I was wearing what I thought was quite a nice outfit, so I added the jacket today, which I bought for $7 in a thrift store. So hopefully that's going to work. But I don't really want to like make you feel sorry about for my mediocrity, but instead I want to talk about how nice it is to be surrounded by such talented people. And I live a blessed life surrounded by talented people in everything that I do. I work at the New York Times R&D group. There's 5 of us from the R&D group, 7 of us from the R&D group right here. Alexis and Agnes and Brian and Noah and Nick are here. Are you guys here? These guys are geniuses of all kinds of different levels, and their skills are really amazing, and I just always feel so happy to be able to work with them. And I also I work with these two guys a lot. This is Mark Hansen, who some of you have met on the right, and Ben Rubin on the left. And Mark and Ben are really my heroes, and the idea of working with them always seems really surreal to be sitting in a room and cooperating with these guys. And of course at Eyeo, I'm part of a really great team, and a lot of people have been talking about Eyeo being the sort of Dave and Jer show, but Wes, who introduced me, and Julian, who's not actually here this year, did way more work than I did. I sent out 49 emails. That's all I did. Wes and his group built the website. Julian built the mobile app, and Dave, as you know, did basically everything else. But let's get into the real meat of things. I'm going to start by talking about a project which considers the concept of nearness. Considers the concept of personal location. It's a project that I introduced for the first time in public this time last year at the conference. So before I get there, though, we're going to walk through an older project. And this is one of my favorite people in the world, somebody that I really admire and respect, maybe the smartest person I've met. His name is Albert Laszlo Barabási, and he's kind of the father of network science. And a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity and the great pleasure to work with him on a project at Wired Magazine. And this is a crappy graph that started that process. What happened with that project was that Laszlo had been lucky enough to get his hands on a month's worth of cell phone data from an unnamed European country. It's actually a European country that has a name. I'm just not allowed to tell you what it is. And so we started doing these graphical explorations. And I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I just want to tell you a little bit about the character of the data. This is this massive data set of numbers. That sort of power law distribution graph that we're seeing. The people on the very far left, they're people that talk a lot on their cell phones, 84 hours a week on their cell phones. The people on the right are people who only text message. And we can kind of take any subset of this massive piece of data, and we see this curve. Obviously, the curve gets cleaner and prettier as we get more numbers in it, but we see that curve. And I love that curve as a data person, but I hate it as a designer, because this is not a magazine spread waiting to happen. So I have this strategy whenever I'm working on print pieces. I call it the ooh-ah strategy. And the ooh-ah strategy is that let's make something that makes people go, ooh, it attracts their attention. And then let's make something called ah, that makes them go, ah, they learn. And I really believe that those two things need to be present in any real functional piece involving data. So those graphs became the ooh. We took all of our data and stacked them in these kind of abstracted versions of those graphs, just to say to people, hey, this is a lot of data. And then on the right-hand side, we took a closer look at the data. So I'm just going to zoom into those columns so that you can see the detail on them. Each stack that you're seeing there is one person in the data set and their calling activity over that month. So this is the spread as it looked on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, we use these things which I really like, and we called them mobility maps. So we had a subset of that data set of cell phone data where we had their location as well. And so these mobility maps tell us a lot about these individual people. So over a period of about 4 days, this person stayed within a 2.1 kilometer radius, and they went back and forth. So we call these people commuters. And this person is a local wanderer. We don't really know why, but they sort of stay in a region. And I think maybe stay-at-home parents, people who go to the park and the school and things like that. And then there's the same person we saw before flattened. And then the third version is this middle person, which is kind of the traveler. And what was interesting to me is that I had this experience when I was doing this a familiarity. And I thought for a while that the thing that I was remembering in the back of my consciousness was that scene from The Matrix where they're watching the numbers trickle down and saying, oh, can't you see that's the lady in the red dress, or we can see what these numbers are actually building out to people's lives. But actually, I don't think that's the case. I think it comes from this passage from a book called Cryptonomicon by one of my favorite authors, Neal Stephenson. And I'll just give you 5 minutes to read it. Yeah, just kidding. I'm going to do something which I think I wish that happened more with Neal Stephenson. I'm going to edit him down into a little bit of an abstraction. So this is a thought experiment in the book, and the thought experiment goes something like this. If we took somebody and attached a light bulb to their head, and we watched from the side as they walked through the streets of London, we would see as they dipped when they stepped onto a road, and then we would see when they came up as they stepped off of the road. So here we can imagine this path as this path of one person with a light bulb on their head. And the thought experiment continues by saying, let's imagine that we have thousands of these paths or millions of these paths. What could we do with those thousands of paths? What could we do with those millions of paths? Well, the character in the book argues that given those paths, a group of very clever people in a room with nothing but those paths could produce a map of London. They could look at those dips, and they could figure out how those dips connected. And in doing so, they would be able to, without ever seeing London, they would be able to come up with that map. And I realized that this is what I was thinking about when I was working on that project with Barabási. This idea that we can take huge amounts of data, very big amounts of information, and using some ingenuity, we can turn them into something. We can turn it into something that means much more than what the data itself would mean. In this case, a very small piece of a map of London. So this has a name, this idea of letting people do measurement and then using the data that they've gathered and doing something with it kind of without their knowledge. We call this opportunistic sensing. It's kind of a weird word, but it's kind of how everybody makes money on the internet in one way or the other. And the word opportunistic, I think, is really important here. It's the conscious policy and practice of taking selfish advantage over circumstances with little regard for principles or what the consequences are for others. And this is the motto of most big data practice these days, I think. So last year, I introduced a project which embraces this idea and talks about this idea, and I think what is an interesting way. Because the spring of last year, there was a big scandal because it was revealed that Apple was recording your location data without your knowledge. They were using you as an opportunistic sensor. In this case, what they were opportunistically sensing was they were sensing Wi-Fi signal strength. So they were using you as a mobile signal to get the Wi-Fi points that they can then helpfully try to make it so that you could get better geographic data from your phone. But of course there was a ton of privacy issues, but we were actually really interested in this idea of taking this huge amount of data and giving it to people who could use that ingenuity that we were talking about before for the powers of good. So there are a lot of researchers like Dr. Barabashi for whom this data is gold. Location data is the basis of a lot of the work that they do, but they have a hard time getting it. All of us in this room right now have location data, and there's, I don't know how many of you in this room right now, 200 or so. That in its own is a pretty good data set for a location scientist. But if we can multiply that by 10 or 20 or 30 or 100 or 1,000, we start to get numbers that are really interesting. So we have this project that came out of the New York Times R&D group called OpenPass, in which you can do two things. You can start recording your own location data, and you can broker an arrangement or a relationship with a researcher who may want to use your data. You know, it's funny, I was talking to Marius earlier, and he said, I like OpenPass, but it doesn't really do anything. Which is true, it doesn't really do anything. It collects your data. You can go online and you can look at some very simple map-based visualizations. Here we're seeing the time-based data of a piece of Brian's data. I would have shown my own, but we just got the Android app made recently, and I don't have enough data to make it totally interesting. Night and day, weekend and weekday, so on and so on. Really simple stuff. But the really key here thing that we're doing is we're giving people the experience of data ownership. We're saying, hey, why don't you take possession of this data which you legally and rightfully own? And so this idea of first-party access is really important to what we're doing. We know about the third party a lot because we see these warnings that say, would you like to grant a third party access to your data? So the third party is this developer. The second party is Facebook, but the first party doesn't get invited to the party at all. Right? We're not there. And location data is really interesting. And what it allows people also to do is experience this personal relationship with data, which I think is really, really, really important and central to my own practice. This comes from a guidebook for district attorneys in LA. So these are DAs who are going and legally demanding people's location data from cell phone providers. And I love this because they understand something that most people, I think, don't understand, which is that cell phones have become the virtual biographer of our daily lives. I like this idea that a lawyer somewhere was like, a cell phone is a virtual biographer of our daily activities. So let's steal that information and use it in court. So you can do some really beautiful things with OpenPass. We have an API. You can download your own data. These are some experiments that Brian House has been doing in our lab to look at what he's calling meaningful places from his data. So these are some meaningful places for him in New York City. These are some meaningful places from his last year's trip to Eyeo in Minneapolis. We also have people right now working on third-party applications for OpenPass. So this is an application that'll allow you to upload your OpenPass data and get some information, some statistical information. And anybody who's interested in playing with this stuff, it's really easy to access, both from a personal level and also from an app building level. And I would really be happy to talk to you about it, and I know Brian would be really happy to talk to people as well. I've been doing some explorations of this location data, and I've been really interested in getting the map out of the picture. I think the map in location data is so ubiquitous, but not necessarily necessary. And so these are all of my travel vectors in the location data. So which direction I was moving, and right now they're arranged by time of day, radially. I can separate them a little bit into speed categories. So at the top, this is driving, and then biking, and then walking, and then, driving, biking, walking, and then the ones that we're not entirely sure of what the speed of those things are. And I love this idea of taking this data and abstracting it to such an extent that it becomes something beautiful. And I think that these graphics, they show me something about my information, but they also tell me something about the broader character of the data. They show me its complexity, they show me its size, and so on and so on and so on. And so this direct relationship with researchers is a really interesting part of our project, and I'm hoping there's people in the audience who maybe either are involved or know people who are involved that can put us in touch. We have a page where you can propose a project for OpenPass, and then that proposal gets sent out to people, and you have to, everybody who's in our project has to give consent for their data to be involved in any of these projects. So I don't know if you've ever looked at location data. It looks like this. Not very exciting, but like the lawyers in California, I've really started to learn that location data can tell a story, and so I'm going to use that as a branching point to jump to the next part of what I want to talk about. A month ago, I was in Graz, which is a beautiful city in Austria, and I was giving a talk, which was the sort of earlier version of this one, although 80% of it has changed. And I was wandering through the city, right near where that little dot is, and I came upon a plaque, which is going to be a nice jump for us. This is a plaque that was about Johannes Kepler, possibly history's greatest astronomer. And Johannes Kepler had lived in Graz for 5 years. He taught in a Protestant monastery, and he worked on a book at the time, which is called the Mysterium Cosmographicum. I can never say it totally correctly. And there's the translation of the plaque. So this work that he was there working on for 5 years, Mysterium Cosmographicum, was this really big and very ambitious work. At the time, astronomers were doing something like our character from Neil Stephenson's book were doing. They were trying to figure out the path of these cosmic objects without really being able to see the whole picture. They could take pieces of it and sew it together. And so Kepler was trying to answer one of the really central problems in astronomy at the time, which is what are the shapes of the orbits of the planets and how can they be described? So he came up with this really ingenious idea, which was that maybe the orbits of these planets actually could be inscribed within the Platonic solids, all of these geometric shapes that are central to mathematics. It was this really beautiful and in some way mystical idea. It was also just totally wrong. So I love this, and I love doing this research to find out, here's Kepler, one of history's greatest scientists. He spent 5 years doing totally the wrong thing, just being as absolutely wrong as he possibly could have. And that gives me a great deal of inspiration to think that maybe even if you go down the path for a very long time, you can right yourself and do something interesting. And of course, he ended up really defining modern astronomy in all kinds of ways because he did figure out what was the described orbits. And that brings me to my next demonstration. Robert doesn't like showing his desktop. There's my desktop. Oh, because I like showing my desktop because it lets me do things like show you a picture of my dog. That's Trapper John, MD. What else do I have here? I have, we have knives, of course, which which you may find out about tonight. And then here's me and the drummer from Sepultura in a fucking cave. that's my favorite picture ever. Okay, so orbits. Here's a planet orbiting a sun in a very, very unrealistic way. There's no real mathematics in here. I'm going to commission Robert to redo this piece for me, but I just wanted to just talk a little bit about an elliptical orbit and what's happening here. And so, who saw the transit of Venus a couple days ago? Who didn't see the transit of Venus? You can see it again in 270 years, so you'll be fine. This is what a transit looks like. So here's a planet that's going to transit in front of its star, and when you're watching it from a distance, that star gets a little dimmer. Now, that's just totally unrealistic measures. If we were talking about the Earth and the Sun, we would see a transit that looks something like that. Obviously, it would be slower, but very, very dim little piece of planet coming in front of that star, usually about 1/10,000th of a change when a planet comes in front of that star. But this act and this mathematics that was discovered by Kepler after he fucked up for 5 years is really, really, really useful for us right now, and it's central to this mission that's happening in NASA called the Kepler mission, which is what I want to talk about for the next little bit. So, the Kepler telescope points at this region of space right around Cygnus Lyra, which is a particularly dense region of space. Can we get the lights down for this part? There's some images that are going to be pretty clear. So to get an idea of the region of space that we're looking at, it's big in astronomy terms. If you hold your hand out at the end of your extended arm and point it at the sky, it's about that much sky. That's a lot of sky for a telescope to look at. And the way that Kepler does it is it has this set of photosensors. And these photosensors are just wide open, and they're measuring these stars. So this is a raw image from the Kepler photosensor. This is what they get from the satellite. And if we zoom in, you can get an idea of how many stars we're dealing with here in this very small region of space. Okay, so guys in a room, they can't really see what's going on, but they have some curves to work with. And these curves look like this. And what happens when a planet passes in front of a star is it dims the light. And so the scientists can look at these light curves, and by looking at these light curves, they can figure out where these planets are. They can figure out how big they are, and from that they can figure out how big their star is, and from that they can figure out what the composition of their star is likely to be. So very much like Stevenson's fictional spy breakers during World War II, here are these astronomers that are using this massive set of data, and they're coming up with these incredibly ingenious ways to work with it. This is Pleiades. It's the world's 7th largest supercomputer. It's the computation power that's doing a lot of the things that we're talking about to get the science to work the way that it wants. It's your 0.4 cents of tax dollars at work. And through this project, they've discovered 2,326 what they call exoplanet candidates. And these exoplanet candidates were first announced in this paper last year. I love this paper because it's obviously important. Do you see how many authors are in there? It's like everybody was like, I want to be on that paper. This is like really one of the greatest achievements in science of recent memory, this Kepler project. And so to really show us the beauty and magnitude of the science, they made these graphics, which kids everywhere have pinned on their walls and dreaming of becoming part of this incredible endeavor of science. Now, you know, I love these graphics, and I know that they're useful for the people that know this system, that know there are stars out there. But for those of us who don't know there are stars and planets, this says nothing. Of taking this and doing something really, truly spatial with it. And I'm lucky enough to have met John Underkoffler, who a lot of you met last night. And John has been bugging me for a long time to come to Oblong and work with some of his crazy technology. And so I decided, yeah, let's take this technology and do something that I think maybe does some service to the fact that these scientists have found 48 planets that could at some point maybe support the future of humanity. So we built this system in about a week. This is a prototype. It's sort of really really dirty and rough at this time, but I wanted to show it to you anyways because I think it gives us some really interesting ideas about how a system like this spatial system of orbits can really take advantage of an interface that isn't a mouse and a keyboard. And I won't talk too much about that part of it because John did such a good job with it. I will say though that this excuse that we can transition through gave me that information in a way that the paper, if I was literate in that type of language, would have done, but I'm not literate in that type of language. So here are the exoplanets in a slightly different space. So space. I always loved this. I like this project a lot, but I always felt that it was not where I wanted it to be. And I had this dream of taking this and doing something really, truly spatial with it. And I'm lucky enough to have met John Underkoffler, who a lot of you met last night. And John has been bugging me for a long time to come to Oblong and work with some of his crazy technology. And so I decided, yeah, let's take this technology and do something that I think maybe does some service to the fact that these scientists have found 48 planets that could at some point maybe support the future of humanity. So we built this system in about a week. This is a prototype. It's sort of really dirty and rough at this time, but I wanted to show it to you anyways because I think it gives us some really interesting ideas about how a system like this spatial system of orbits can really take advantage of an interface that isn't a mouse and a keyboard. And I won't talk too much about that part of it because John did such a good job with it. I will say though that this experience of working with this technology took me a lot by surprise. I think like many people in the room, watching demos, you're always skeptical, right? I was really skeptical of these things, and then I got there and you put on these gloves and started to use these gestures, and it just totally changed the way I thought about how I was interacting. I've always been really interested in the idea of a data visualization as interface. How can we use the data as an interface instead of having an interface for the data? And what this project allowed me to do more than any other project I've ever worked on is exactly that. There is no interface on the screen here. It's you and the data, which to me is like this really pure moment and something that I was really excited to get a chance to work on. I'll just let this play out for a second because there's a moment at the end here which I think is really important to understand some of the stuff that this system does. And here we have the same functionality basically that was built into the original system, but working on this really large surface alone does something that is really important for data as well. At the times we look at these things too, we have a 5-screen video wall outside that we use as an interface because sometimes with large amounts of data, you really do need that large surface. And this is really common in a lot of places. I visited the PayPal Network Operations Control Center a few weeks ago. And again, they have this massive surface to display their data because there's so much data that a small screen is going to run into problems. I'm just going to skip to the end part. This one's online. Oh, missed it. There you go. So one thing we can do with this system is use multiple objects. This can be it's a table in this case, but it could be a laptop. So you can move things from that data set onto a smaller piece, and then you can literally just close your laptop, walk away, open it, and have that set of data to work with on your own, which I thought was a really interesting thing. And I had the chance to show this to the guys the men and women at Kepler, and that was one of the things they were really excited about as an interface. All right. So as a data person, I get so excited to work with data like this, and I think a lot of us get really excited to work with data that it's big and exotic and scientifically interesting. But a quote from one of my favorite musicians that I've been thinking about a lot is this one, that near is just as far away from as far. Sometimes the things that are very close to us can be really as interesting as the ones that we imagine to be far away. It's kind of a expansion of this grass is greener idea. So to introduce this part of the talk, I want to talk about the work of somebody who I unfortunately couldn't invite to Eyeo this year, Theodore Zabalos. He's 10 years old, so I don't think that he's quite ready for it, but I love his work. This is a piece that he did. He was reading the Iliad, and he was trying to understand the Iliad. So he drew this system to help him understand how it all worked. What a great idea. And then the one that really got me, this is him mapping his level of interest in the various characters of the Avengers as the Avengers move through. So I wrote this comment on his mom's blog, actually, and I said, I really love these pieces. I love the Avengers one. I'm a big fan. And then somebody said, you should do something like this about the Avengers too. And I thought, okay, I will. So here's all of the issues of the Avengers comic. This is like my childhood in one snapshot right here. It started being published in 1963. And I read all of these. I've read all of them 3 times. I read all of them once when I was about 14 or 15. I read all of them once when I moved to college and got all my comic books again. And then I read all of them once with a machine a couple of weeks ago. And these are so great. And so in the 60s, we have these types of things. It's like xenophobia embodied, right? Strange people from other places coming, and they're scary. And that type of like really over-the-top stuff continues for quite a while in these comics. And then topical things come in. This issue was during the 70s, where everyone thought the next big freeze was coming. And so these evil characters called the Weathermen were changing the weather, and the world was going to hell, which is actually, this should sell a lot more issues these days. My favorite one, terrible. This is terrible. This is the low point right here, right? It's like, for both people, right? Like, for Marvel, for Letterman, for me, for everybody. And then it just got really dark in the 90s and kind of sexy in the 90s. That was what was happening with comics, and so everything was which is like impossible with the Avengers. Like, it's a guy with a fucking flag on his shield and Thor. Like, you can't really make it dark very well. And then the new ones, they are very much in the spirit of the movie that we just recently saw. So, if you've just seen the movie, you might think of the Avengers as kind of like the Beatles, right? There's like a central group of them, but they're not like the Beatles at all. They're like Menudo or like the board from Yahoo. They just change all the time. And so there's 131 Avengers. I didn't know that. 131 Avengers. These are they're now on a logarithmic scale, so we can see who it was in the comics the most. So there's not that many popular Avengers. There's the graph of that, so you see a real cluster who we can kind of think of as the core Avengers there. But there's some who's a triathlon fan? He has the power of 3 men. This is the Whizzer. I'm not kidding you. He's had a transfusion of mongoose blood, which makes him very fast and angry. And then my personal favorite, Star Fox, who has the power. I'm not making any of this up, to simulate the pleasure center of people's brains. And he once was sued for sexual harassment in the comic. I read this stuff when I was 14. But this system of coloring kind of gets us a way to explore this history of this really quite amazing cultural artifact in an interesting way. Here's all the issues and all the Avengers. And we can use that kind of format to dig in a little bit. So these are all the female Avengers. This is a really long graphic, which maybe shows you why I tend to sometimes use radial graphics on my blog, because I can't put that on my blog. It's a really long graphic, and it shows us some kind of interesting things. There have been women on the Avengers since the beginning, but only a handful of them, the same ones, kind of repeating over and over again. And then during the 80s, there was a really big boom of female Avengers, and then towards the end of the run of the title, not so many. Here's the same graphic in radial form, which lets you see it a little bit more clearly. And then, gender is a thing we can apply to culture to divide people up reasonably easily, right? Sex or gender. in the comics, we can also do like, here's all the gods and Eternals in the comics, which is kind of interesting because these things really go in and out of favor. And as a comic reader, it reminded me of, like, I didn't pay attention to any of this stuff when I was going through the series, but doing these exercises really taught me a little bit more about it. These are the same one for robots, so really patchy. And then one thing that we have to think about whenever we think about data, but this data in particular, is that data is about people. And I'm not talking about triathlon and the wizard. I'm talking about the people who wrote these things and drew these things. So this is a graph that shows all of the letterers of the comic. And up on the top left, you'll see this kind of two that are right in the beginning, and they're kind of going to go sporadically. And that's because there were two letterers on the Avengers in the beginning who alternated. So they would do one issue and then the other, and then one and then the other, and then one and the other. Something I had no idea about as an Avengers fan, but kind of came out of this graphic. And then the editors of the Avengers over time. That's a funny picture. And if personally, this really opened my eyes to what this whole system, this whole story was about. You remember, I thought I was 14 when I read this series, and 14-year-olds are not really ready. So one question I was interested in was that female thing I was talking about before, was that due to an editorial choice, or was it just like a cultural thing? So was there an editor who said, hey, we need more female Avengers, or I like robots, let's get some more robot Avengers? So actually, it turns out, it looks like there is. There's this guy, Jim Shooter, who's in the middle there, was the editor of the Avengers between 1978 and about 1985, and during that period was by the most female Avengers characters, which seems really good, but this is Jocasta, typical of female Avengers characters. And, one of these things that I was doing the graphs, and I was like, I've got gods, and I've got like the female Avengers characters, and I've got robots, and here's like this god robot Avenger who was named after Oedipus's mother. Like, again, terrible things for a 14-year-old to be reading, but actually this experience was really interesting for me, and like Theo, who drew his graph of Avengers' interestingness, I came out of it with a much broader understanding of what I got out of this as a child, and how it maybe led to me being fully formed, or in whatever type of fully formed way I may exist. So I told you before that I don't like to talk about what I do as data visualization, although data visualization plays an important role in what I do. I think that what I actually do is I'm doing creative research. I'm researching these stories and these ideas and these concepts that are sometimes very far away from me and more often are very close to me. And hoping that some of the things that I discover, I usually open source all of my code, I write about a lot of this stuff, will help other people in their own creative research. And then finally, I think that what I do in every project is I try to gain a personal relationship to the data. And that might be in researching about Kepler and finding out who he was and what he did and where he lived and so on and so on and so on. It may be looking at the authors of these comics. It may be looking at the people who are involved in these human systems that we're so often dealing with as far as data is concerned. I want to end with one last thing, and I have a hard time explaining why I love data and why I do what I do, and fiction sometimes is really good at explaining things that we can't really understand. So this is a quote from The Crying of Lot 49. She looked down a slope, needing to squint for the sunlight, into a vast sprawl of houses which had grown up all together like a well-tended crop from the dull brown earth, and she thought of the time that she'd opened up a transistor radio to replace a battery and see her first printed circuit. The ordered swirl of houses and streets from this high angle sprang at her now with the same unexpected, astonishing clarity as the circuit card had. Though she knew even less about radios than the Southern Californians, they were both outward pattern. They were to both outward patterns a hieroglyphic sense of concealed meaning and of an intent to communicate. There seemed to be no limit to what the printed circuit could have told her if she had tried to find out. And that's kind of the way that I feel about data. I feel like there's an intent to communicate within these systems, and it's my job and our job and collective job to try to understand what that system was. And just to sort of bring things full circle, we we've looked at a lot of projects that involve looking at single threads, looking at single things, and then from understanding those single things, we can then understand the system. So how can we look at a small piece of something and turn it into something bigger? And from looking at that bigger thing, gain an understanding that we would have never been able to see had we not begun at the start. So that's all I have. Thank you.